Thank you. After watching the movie Sick and Sicker, I've seen it twice now, and I just have to share something with you. It's the second time I've seen it, and when I watch that movie, my heart just pounds because it's totally real to me. Having lived in Canada for 41 years and worked in that system for 13 years, other than my wife and my two kids, my whole family's up there, my parents, my wife's parents, relatives and whatnot, and what they're telling you is completely real. I wasn't going to give a specific patient anecdote, but it seems appropriate after seeing that show. About 7 or 8 years ago, my brother was on an airline flight, and when they descended, his ear plugged up, and the sense of stuffiness wasn't relieved. It persisted. He ended up seeing an ENT surgeon, and he ended up getting a myringotomy tube. And my mother told me this, and I thought, geez, that's odd. The development of a serous effusion in the middle ear in an adult is actually classic in the neuroradiology textbooks for developing nasopharyngeal cancer. Well, I just kind of assumed that he would have had his nasopharynx inspected, didn't think much of it, but then over the subsequent months, he developed headaches and facial pain, eventually started getting lymphadenopathy within his neck and whatnot, and I'm thinking, maybe he does have nasopharyngeal cancer. So I had several conversations with him and his wife, and I said, you really need to get imaging of your head and neck. He did not get the imaging that he needed. Christmas Day a few years ago, he totally decompensated, and at that time his kids were quite small. He had to seek out medical care, but in the community that he's in, there is no MRI scanner, and I'd been advising him to get an MRI scanner, although there is one available for pets. So he went to the community 20 miles away, got admitted through the emergency department, and was in terrible pain, had to have narcotics and whatnot. Well, it was Christmas, and of course, the hospitals operate out of budgets down there rather than profit. So he didn't get the imaging that he needed really that day. It happened to be that my parents were visiting at that time. My father is a retired judge and a very forceful person that is used to getting his way, and basically demanded that he get an MRI scan. Well, they conceded to do an MRI scan on Boxing Day, which is the day after Christmas in Canada. Even though normally they wouldn't do it, they did it. The initial read from the radiologist was that he had sinusitis. And I got this news, and I said, there's no way he's got sinusitis. I mean, he's losing weight, he's got lymphadenopathy within his neck, blah, blah, blah. I got in the plane, flew up to Canada. My sister had got a copy of the MRI. Went to her house in the evening before I could see him in the hospital, put the scan up, and he had a huge nasopharyngeal mass. So he had nasopharyngeal cancer. It was invading the skull base, the dura, cavernous sinus, was wrapped around one of the carotid arteries. It was just a mess. So anyways, long story short, I spoke to the hospitalist involved. I told him who I was. I said, this is nasopharyngeal cancer. And he agreed that he needed emergency radiotherapy and whatnot. Well, it took 7 weeks before he got treatment. Anyways, the moral of the story is it's true that there's massive delays in getting health care in Canada. The moral of the story isn't that all Canadian doctors don't know what they're doing. Anyways, here is the cover of my book, Health Reform, The End of the American Revolution. And, that explores my journey from being sort of a default de facto socialist, believing in government health care, and my evolution to a hardcore right-winger that knows the truth that we need free markets in health care. I used to believe in that system, I used to defend that system, but I don't anymore. And the central theme of the book is about, the achievement of the American Revolution is characterized by the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is destroyed once the people are okay with government telling them when the people are okay with the government telling them what type, quality, and amount of health care they're allowed to have. And once that happens, the citizens are no longer free, sovereign, self-governing citizens. They are then servile wards of the state. And that is not what America's about. Now, this is a quote from one of my favorite authors, Thomas Sowell. He's well worth reading. He writes a lot about politics and economics. And he says, the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything, never enough of everything for those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. If I was to summarize the essence of my book in a sentence, it's Ronald Reagan's quote, which is, man is not free unless government is limited. And I came to realize the truth of this statement with my experiences working up in healthcare in Canada. Healthcare was merely the lens by which I came to realize this. But normally when I'm at events talking to people, I like to take the time to talk about things like what we would do for the poor in a truly free society, and Dr. Ackes addressed that. I like to speak about issues like what government healthcare does to the spirit of the people, and why healthcare is not a right, and why liberty does not mean being cared for by government. And that government healthcare is all intrinsically coercive. But rather than talking about philosophic things like that, I've decided to talk about something a little bit more basic and practical, and that is why Obamacare will make Canadian healthcare look like a model of efficiency. Now, just in case, after seeing Sick and Sicker, you don't believe that government healthcare is inefficient and ineffective, I'll try to disabuse you of that notion right now. The Fraser Institute, based out of Vancouver, does a yearly survey of waiting lists, and the average wait time to see a specialist in Canada is 17.3 weeks, and you need a referral from a family doctor to see a specialist. So that really doesn't count the full wait. Some specialists, like orthopedic surgeons, the wait's as high as, I believe, 36 to 38 weeks. That's average. And I knew several specialists up in Canada that I worked with that had 2-year waiting lists. Now, 16% of the Canadian population has no access to primary care. And when I tell people that, often their eyes glaze over it. They just don't comprehend it. What that means is if you have high blood pressure or diabetes or chronic lung disease, it is simply not being addressed. The disease will take its natural course. Short of when you go to the emergency department, and you've seen how congested those emergency departments can be. When I was medical director of diagnostic imaging up in Thunder Bay, Canada, our wait time for a period of time was 13 months for an MRI scan. And in fact, that waiting list was rapidly growing, and I was successful twisting the arm of the administration to increase the time that we operated the scanner to get more patients through. We managed to get it down to about 4 months. It was a 7-month wait for a CAT scan. Now, just what I think of it, up in Thunder Bay, some areas of the country, the primary care situation is much worse. In fact, in Thunder Bay, it was estimated as many as 40% of the population of 115,000 people had no access to primary care. So their illnesses are simply not being addressed. In Newfoundland, the waiting time for an MRI scan has been as much as 2.5 years. In my hometown of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, where I grew up and still go every year because we have a cabin on the lake, newcomers to town wait about 5 years to see a family doctor, unless they have some sort of connections within the system and can get in sooner. And then there have been cases, some summers we've been up there, there's been no general surgeon on call. For the region, the next nearest hospital is about 180 miles away. If you rupture your spleen in a car accident, you're just out of luck. For a period, they were so short-staffed, the emergency department, that they closed it at night. In some communities, they've actually taken to having lotteries for family doctors. And true to government mediocrity, what they do is they set benchmarks for what's an acceptable wait time for various procedures and whatnot. The benchmarks are met 70% of the time in 30% of the provinces. So they're not doing too well. This is a picture out of the online version of the Canadian Globe and Mail, which is sort of Canada's equivalent of the New York Times, only from about 5 weeks ago. And the name of the article is "The Soul-Destroying Search for a Family Doctor," and it chronicles the experience of a writer who had not had a family doctor for a very protracted period of time. And she was living in Ottawa, and a new family doctor office opened up in Barrhaven, which is just outside of town. And this is the lineup of people trying to get in with this family doctor office. And there was, it wasn't like it was a giant clinic opening. It was just 2 or 3 doctors and all these people trying to get in. The caption along the bottom, in case you can't read it, was, "There were just as many people behind me," Gloria Galloway says of the lineup for a family doctor. Now, there's another interesting thing about this picture. Notice that they're not holding any placards and they're not protesting. They're just lining up like cattle that are accepting their fate. And I often get asked about, why do Canadians accept this? Well, you got to look at the history of Canada. Like on my mother's side of the family, they moved to Canada in protestation against the American Revolution because they wanted to remain subjects of the British Crown. So there's a different view in Canada about how you should know your place, you accept what you're told, do what you're told, and accept what you're given. So it's a very different view than what Americans experience. So technically, as subjects of the British Crown, Canadians live by permission rather than by right. Now, there's some things I really like about living in the United States, not the least of which is that the homes are bigger and the consumer goods are cheaper. I also like that in Minnesota, the weather is warmer and the taxes are lower. But the most important thing about living in America that is just so refreshing is the segment of society epitomized by organizations like AAPS and the Tea Partiers that recognize when the boot of government is across their throat and they're ready to protest against it. Just briefly, outcomes. Dr. Heeb talked about this a little bit. It's a completely false argument comparing different populations of Canada and the United States. Canadians live about 2 years longer than Americans, but it has nothing to do with the healthcare system. The Canadian population traditionally is more homogeneously Caucasian, based out of, originally out of France and Britain, and some of the Eastern European countries. The more homogeneous population, whereas you have a more heterogeneous population in the United States with more races. Some races intrinsically just don't live as long as other races, even when you correct for socioeconomic differences. So it's not a valid comparison, and then according to Sally Pipes, if you factor out deaths from traffic accidents and violent crimes, Americans are in fact the longest lived people in the Western world, but the liberal press never tells you that. The other, it often comes up, oh, isn't that horrible? The United States spends 17% of their GDP on healthcare. Isn't that horrible and wasteful? Well, I would say not necessarily. I have a friend that a few years ago, he was in a snowmobile accident, had a traumatic injury to his thigh. He got an MRI right away, found out the quadriceps tendon was completely torn. That told him they need to do an operation to fix that. I fell off a ladder a few years ago, had a badly comminuted fracture of my navicular bone. I got a CT scan right away, which told the surgeon it was too comminuted to put in plates and screws. He would just use a conservative treatment method. And all that information is useful. If you have left lower quadrant pain and we get a CAT scan on you, we did not do CAT scans when I was in Thunder Bay for abdominal pain. Our policy was we're too booked up, you guys got to figure it out clinically. But, in the United States, you have left lower quadrant pain, you get a CAT scan, it shows that you have diverticulitis, there is an abscess, there isn't an abscess, is it accessible to drainage, is it not accessible, et cetera, et cetera. That is all useful information in the treatment, but may have absolutely no impact upon your longevity, but it is useful and it does cost money. You also hear propaganda about how, the United States is 37th in the world, according to the World Health Organization, but that is based on socialist parameters such as the degree to which it is funded and regulated by government. If you read the fine print, when it comes to access to physicians and medical care, the United States is actually #1, but the press never tells you that. A key message I'd like to deliver is that central planning does not work. And what I mean by that is planning by government. They alluded to the fact in Sick and Sicker that government controls the number of doctors in Canada. About 20 years ago, there was a commission of the government that saddled with the task of looking in how do we control healthcare costs. And the conclusion they came to is we need fewer doctors because doctors are cost centers, not so much because of their fees, but because of the fact that they order tests and admit patients to hospital. So it was formal government policy to cut down the number of doctors. They reduced the admissions to medical school, and they overcompensated a little bit too much. So we have per capita about 30% fewer doctors than there are in the United States. So it's an example of how central planning doesn't work. And in fact, we had desperate shortages where I was in Thunder Bay. We had 3 radiologists for a population of 250,000 people for a while. I was reading probably 40,000, maybe even 50,000 cases a year, when at that time the American College of Radiology, what they considered safe was about 15,000. This was before we were doing everything on computer screens. I was doing most of the angiography, all of the angioplasty, reading half of the MRIs with heavy administrative duties as well. So we were just desperately short of doctors. Now the roloscope is now an outdated device, but it was a device in common use before where you could load films onto this machine, and a clerk would load the films and you would push a button and move from case to case to case. It would facilitate reading large volumes of x-rays. And I went to the president of the hospital. I said, we're really killing ourselves here to sustain the service. We need some help. We need a roloscope. And his response was, well, we've used up our budget. We have no money in the budget for this type of thing. Perhaps you can make a case to the bureaucrats of the Ministry of Health 700 miles away. So I made a case that we needed a special dispensation of funds to get a roloscope. Well, the radiologists in Thunder Bay never got the roloscope for 3 years. I was long gone. I was fed up and just gave up. But once they got the rolloscope, they set it up and they realized, oh, we don't have any money in the budget to have a clerk load the films. So it just collected cobwebs for another year. So it just shows you how incredibly cumbersome government can be. If you look at a complex system like weather that's affected by multiple variables, it's somewhat similar to the economy in that the economy is affected by multiple variables. And if you have enough information in the form of multivariable equations and multivariable equations and enough data, theoretically you could predict with some precision what the weather is going to be in a period of time. But as you probably know, if one variable is off by an infinitesimally small amount, the projection is just way, way off. Well, what does that have to do with healthcare? Well, the economy is the same. There's all kinds of variables that go into the economy, and healthcare is a part of the economy. But what they do in government healthcare is they try to figure out things, what the funding is for a given emergency department, how many doctors are going to have, how many nurses, how many hospital beds. So they're not just taking wild guesses on, one variable. They're taking wild guesses on multiple variables with the hope that it's all going to work out. But the machine just doesn't work that way, and so what you get are shortages. Just another example of how centralized planning the economy simply does not work. And Friedrich Hayek used the term the fatal conceit, the belief that bureaucrats can run the economy better than the spontaneous decisions of free individuals in a free market. Barack Obama has that fatal conceit. Canadian bureaucrats have that fatal conceit too, that they can run things better than a free market. Central planning does not work. And yet, having said that, these are all flavors of central planning that have been bandied about at both the national level and at our state level. Electronic medical records, preventative care, managed care, baskets of care, resource management, coordinated care, comparative effectiveness research, and pay for performance. They're all just different forms of central planning that will simply not work. Accountable care organizations. This is one of these crazy schemes within Obamacare that I'm sure you've heard about. There's a few things that really bothered me about it. Well, firstly, they've shown they're expected to be extremely expensive to set up. The idea is that a parcel of money will go with a patient with a given diagnosis to these accountable care organizations. And then the doctors in the hospitals have to fight it out for who gets how much of that pile of money. So what is currently a fairly amicable relationship is going to become very divisive. But the thing that is most bothersome of all about these accountable care organizations is the fact that monies earned by the hospital and the doctors will be based on the money that they don't spend on the patient, which I think is hugely unethical. I have pointed that out at various staff meetings and whatnot, and I've never had a satisfactory response to rebut that conclusion. Now, on the other hand, decentralized control would work. It works in all other aspects of a free market. I mean, look at computers and TVs. I mean, they get better and better and better, and that's all because free individuals make free decisions in a free market and transact with one another as they see fit. This decision-making power should be put into the 309 million Americans that we have in this country, the 850,000 doctors, the 2.5 million nurses, and the 5,818 hospitals. Price controls do not work. When I was up in Thunder Bay, I had this vision of having a full-service radiology department, and I wasn't a very good economist, but I was willing to do angioplasties, and I was the only person in the region willing to do iliofemoral angioplasties. And as you know, the idea is you put a catheter up, and you have a balloon on that catheter, you stretch out the stenosis, and the patient's blood flow improves. Well, for all of that time, effort, and liability, I would only make $90. Now, just by comparison, last winter, my snowblower went on the fritz, and it was $99 just to get the mechanic just to lay eyes on the thing before he did anything. And I'm not disparaging the efforts of snowblower repair people, but there is a little bit of a disparity there. Lumbar facet injections, where you use fluoroscopy to guide a needle into the facet joint, inject a little bit of corticosteroid and some anesthetic, $14. And if they wanted both sides done, which was usually the case, they wouldn't pay you for the other side. You had to do it for free. And it's a good example of how price controls don't work. We were so busy, we just said, you know what, we can't do facet injections anymore. We just withdrew the service. And it simply shows price controls don't work. The inevitable result of centralized planning and price controls, shortages. And in fact, price controls have been tried since Babylon. They've never worked, and the politicians just don't get that. As you well know, health insurance is really prepaid medical care. We pay our health care with taxes and or premiums. We want our money's worth. So we have an illness or injury, we want a full court press, everything possible done. So if both physicians and doctors have no accountability for the expenses, and I see that every day, just extreme overutilization of tests for the most absolutely trivial things. So it's not really insurance, it's prepaid medical care. Real insurance is made for compensating for large unexpected financial losses. A couple years ago, I had some serious damage to the roof on my house. It was a $35,000 repair. My insurance kicked in. The insurance does not pay for my floor wax. Milton Friedman talks about other people's money. We just, humans being humans, we don't have good stewardship of other people's money. Nothing's going to change that. That's just the way it is. So these factors result in expensive insurance and expensive health care. As you probably know, the uninsured problem in the United States is vastly over-exaggerated. At any given moment, there's about 48 million uninsured people. The turnover rate in those people is extremely high. I'm forgetting the statistic at the tip of my tongue. It's somewhere in the order of 50% of those people within 6 months will have insurance. So this is not a static population. It's a turnover of people that are between jobs. There's 12 million illegal aliens in this country. In Canada, ultra-liberal Canada, if you're in the country illegally, you do not have access to public health insurance plan, the public health insurance plan. Why? Because you're in the country illegally. If you were sick, you would get care, but you would get a bill. There's 14 million people in this country that qualify for government programs and have simply not filled out the paperwork, and yet they're counted as uninsured. 18 million people earn more than $50,000 a year. 10 million earn more than $75,000 a year. According to my friend Dave Racer up in Minnesota, the true hardcore uninsured is only about 8 million people in the United States. Not to say that that's an insignificant problem, but it doesn't require a blanket solution for everyone in the country. Obamacare is doomed to fail. It's based on everything that has been proven to not work. Price controls on medical services and insurance, centralized planning, third-party payment, pitting doctors and hospitals against one another, and we have good proof of all this with Massachusetts, where they have mandatory insurance. Healthcare costs have gone up and up and up. Insurance costs have gone up, and the availability and access to physicians is increasing all the time. Obamacare does not break free from the status quo. Obamacare reinforces it. And I'm sure you know, simple reforms would work. Health savings accounts where people have money that they have stewardship of, and they shop as consumers in a marketplace to get the best deal, the highest value at the lowest price. High deductible insurance, just like my homeowner's plan. It's used to replace large unexpected financial losses. We should be able to buy health care and health insurance across state lines. The tax code needs to be looked at so that things aren't skewed so that we primarily have insurance through our employer. As you know, the employer gets the tax deduction, so this situation is set up where if you lose your job, you lose your insurance. We need to experiment with different types of insurance, like whole life health insurance, where you buy the product and you own the insurance plan for the rest of your life. Deregulation. We don't need 150,000 pages of regulation of Medicare. And we need tort reform. In fact, while I think of it, tort reform is one thing that Canada's always done well. There's always been a cap on pain and suffering at $250,000. And the result is lawsuits are not out of control in Canada like they are here. So the whole system could be fixed quite a bit with just a little bit of tweaking with a screwdriver rather than taking a Sherman tank to the whole system. And I would say that if you must invoke a government healthcare solution, and I am not in favor of government at all, but if you must invoke government as the solution, as a libertarian, I'm not really in favor of that. I would say target the solutions to those 8 million people rather than blowing up the whole system for 300 million people. Just as an aside, MediBid is an interactive web portal for buying and selling medical goods and services. It is part of the solution. Patients put in requests for bids. Doctors can bid on that, including back surgeries or whatever. And it's an attempt to create a true free market using the power of the internet. Full disclosure, I'm Chief Medical Officer of MediBid. The Canada Health Act was 13 pages long. It was institutionalized into law in 1984. The various provinces had been experimenting with different types of one-party payer systems before that, and those 13 pages basically destroyed health care in Canada. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is over 2,500 pages long. So if 13 pages can destroy the system, just imagine what more than 2,500 pages is going to do. There's 159 new federal bureaucracies. 18,000 CPT codes has increased to 140,000. Now, before I left Minnesota, I printed up a copy of the Canada Health Act. This is the Canada Health Act, 13 pages long. And like I say, just totally ruined healthcare in Canada. This is Obamacare. I couldn't fit this into my carry-on bag, so I just showed you a picture instead. This is, as Grace Marie showed us this slide yesterday, this is a simplified version of Obamacare. 70% of the complexity has been eliminated from this. And you know, the physicians, you'll note, are, you know, on one corner, patients are way over in the other corner, and you've got this massive bureaucracy interposed between the two of them, which is just mind-boggling. How can anybody possibly believe that this is going to facilitate the doctor-patient transaction? Well, it's impossible. And I'll tell you, when I was up in Canada, there was only two bureaucracies that I dealt with. One was the Ontario Health Insurance Plan that paid me. And you know, every once in a while they would say, oh, despite the fact that you justly earned this money, we've exceeded our budget and you have to pay some money back, which was, you know, hugely irritating. But the other bureaucracy was the Ministry of Health, which basically their job was to sort of allocate and organize resources. Well, and the way it works in Canada in the Canada Health Act, the individual provinces administer health insurance under the terms set out by the Canada Health Act. And many of the provinces then break themselves down into regions and then administer those various regions with an attempt to be more nimble and agile and responsive to the needs of the patients and hospitals in their area. Well, under Obamacare, you've got a population 10 times the size of Canada being run through Washington, D.C. So imagine how cumbersome that's going to be. Now, the Ministry of Health, when I was up in Canada, we were desperately short of physicians, incredibly short of resources. You know, me and the other doctors, we were just dying trying to deliver care. So one of the doctors in the hospital had an idea, hey, maybe if we have a meeting with the Ministry of Health, we can tell them all our problems and they'll solve them for us. And everybody thought, wow, this is a great idea. Well, it took about 8 months for them to concede to come to a meeting, so we had this big powwow with them. And I put together a presentation, 10 or 15 minutes long, documenting the struggles that we had trying to deliver health care, and I gave my little speech. And there was these 4 or 5 panelists sitting at a table, and I was expecting them to give me some answers on what to do. And I was just met with blank stares. And that was a very numinous event in my life, because then I got it. Government doesn't have any answers. They don't know how to run a complex system. It's actually impossible for them. Anyways, the whole idea of having healthcare run by government, it's just not going to work. Richard Foster, Chief Medicare Actuary, estimates the cost of Obamacare at $222 billion over 10 years. But keep in mind, from the perspective of from 1966, Medicare was expected to cost $12 billion in 1990, but in fact actually cost $107 billion. So who knows what Obamacare is actually going to cost? I am no economist, but I don't like the way this graph looks. This is the interest on the debt, Social Security, and Medicare obligations. They're going the wrong way. You're going to put in a huge entitlement on top of that. It just seems fiscally irresponsible to me. Now, despite all my gloom and doom about Obamacare and how I'm convinced it's going to make healthcare in the United States worse than it is in Canada, Mr. Obama can be pleased that he has the endorsement of several eminent historical figures. Fidel Castro said, "We consider health reform to have been an important battle and success of Obama's government." Vladimir Lenin said, "Socialized medicine is the keystone in the arch of the socialist state." And make no mistake, this is socialized healthcare. The decision-making power is being removed from doctors and patients and being put into the hands of the collective in the form of big government. Nikita Khrushchev said, "The United States will eventually fly the communist flag. The American people will hoist it themselves." Now, rather than dwelling on the endorsements of tyrants, I suggest that we remember what an American hero said. And it's very easy to be seduced by the sense of security that you can get from government health care, but it's a very false sense of security. But Benjamin Franklin said, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Thank you.